Good morning, gentlemen. I'm going to today talk to you about a very important topic. I will focus on China. As you know, China is now in the throes of death. It's a dragon that's writhing like a snake and is wondering what it's going to do. We're going to talk about China because China is in a pincer movement which is continuing against it from a place called America, and the problem has come ever since Donald Trump became the president of the United States. Now, he's a man who's done a lot of, uh, I would say, created a lot of trouble for China, and basically to do with the tariffs which he has imposed on China. At some places, he had imposed 120% tariff, or even more, and the Chinese have retaliated. But then China has got a deficit of rather a surplus of $400 billion in America, and the person is going to suffer in China. So you can just imagine $400 billion which China is earning from America will suddenly become zero because those goods will not be sold. So, gentlemen, what happens next? But before I say what happens next, I'd like to give you a little bit of a history of China. Now, the Chinese history is very picturesque. In the Middle Ages, China was what was known as the center of the world. It was a country where people came because it was supposed to be the center of civilization. Everything emanated from China. But China then went down, and finally the monarchy, the Chinese imperial dynasty, became a liability, and then there was a revolution in 1911 led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, which overthrew the Chinese dynasty and ushered in a republic. Sun Yat-sen died soon, but he left behind the party which was called the Nemesis party. And at that time, after he left from this world, the man called General Chiang Kai-shek took over the party. He was a nationalist and he had an American wife, so he was very closely associated with the Americans. Now, the next thing that happened in China was that the Kuomintang party or the nationalist party couldn't control China. And China now began to get divided in so many portions. They became something called the warlords came on the scene, and they had their own spheres of influence. And at that time, Mao Zedong brought in the Communist Party. And basically, from the period of the Middle Ages to say the 19th century, the Chinese militarily lost a number of battles, particularly the 1842 and 1856 battles which they fought with the British, which were known as the First and the Second Opium Wars. And then they carried out a revolution in 1900 against the Christians, which is known as the Boxer Rebellion, and that also was defeated. The Chinese didn't know what the hell was happening to them. And then a third factor came to China, and that was the Japanese. Now, the Japanese gentlemen has been a very atrocious people, and I think they did atrocities on the Chinese, which is unheard of. And at the same time, the Western powers had a lot of concessions in China. Hong Kong was taken over on lease by the British, and in Shanghai there was the foreign quarter, and everywhere the Chinese missionaries and others were moving around, spreading Christianity. And then Japanese came in, they occupied the whole of Manchuria. Now, why did they occupy in Manchuria? Very simple, because they had no resources, mineral resources in Japan. So if you wanted iron ore or coal or something, you get it from Manchuria. So this was the situation in China till 1945. There was a truce call between the communists and Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, and they fought the Japanese together, but they were defeated at every stage until the Americans threw the two atomic bombs on Japan, and that is the end of Japan. At that time, the Russians came into battle against the Japanese, occupied the whole of Manchuria. They disarmed the Manchurian army, and this Manchurian army, all the weaponry was handed over to the communist Mao Zedong. The Japanese were very clever. What they did was the dynasty which had been overthrown in 1911, the last emperor of China, that is Pu Yi, who was a young boy at that time, was installed as the emperor of Manchukuo as a Japanese puppet. And he became such a big puppet that even his wife got impregnated by a Japanese army officer. Well, I won't dwell much on it. And finally, in 1945, he ran away to Russia. He was captured, brought back to China, but nothing happened to him. He was given a small job to do, and that is, he was made a gardener, and he continued living his life till he fell in love again and died in the 60s. He was the last emperor of China. I'm just digressing on this issue to get an idea of what the Chinese were doing. In the meanwhile, in 1945, there was a civil war which started, and the communists won. There's no doubt about that. And General Chiang Kai-shek ran away to Formosa, which is an island off the coast of China, with his supporters. Almost 1 million of them went there, and the entire mainland was taken over by Mao Zedong. At that time, unfortunately, India had a very, very lackluster man heading India, and he was Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. He didn't know what the hell is happening, because in 1949, just after they'd taken over China, the communists attacked Tibet. They had about 50,000 troops, and within a battle of 2 or 3 months, they occupied the entire Tibet. And Nehru was just sitting on his haunches, and we lost, rather, I would say India lost the entire Tibet as a buffer zone. The Chinese also occupied Xinjiang, which was populated by the Muslims, that is the Uyghur Muslims, the local ones. They did carry out an insurrection, they were fighting, but the Chinese crushed them completely, and their religion, I think, has been obliterated. Well, that is the history of China. But China, I must tell you, has one very good point. They had a one-track mind and a very brilliant mind, because they began with one aim, that they wanted to match America and dominate the world. That was the main thing on which they were relying on. They wanted to dominate the world. And they did something called reverse engineering. So whatever American goods were coming to them or being supplied to them, the Chinese duplicated. And this happened because in 1972, Richard Nixon made a visit to Beijing, and that is a very famous visit. Along with him was Henry Kissinger, another stooge, I don't know whether he was a stooge or the Chinese, I know. But the net result was the Chinese accepted the American proposals, and Chiang Kai-shek was thrown into the Pacific Ocean. He was still alive at that time in 1972, but nothing much happened. Mao Zedong accepted Richard Nixon like an emperor, and Nixon was made to look like a bloody fool. But then that's precisely what happened. And then they began to pour in billions of dollars into China. The Soviet Union broke up in the 90s, and China then took on the mantle of the leader of the communist movement. And now the situation is that China has got an economy of 18 trillion, which is a very big thing, and a per capita income 6 times that of India. And if you get a comparison with India and United States, the US income is 60 times per capita more than India. So the US at the moment is preoccupied with China. What has happened is Donald Trump has come into power, and he has come with an aim to make America great. And he is a man who can sift the sands, and he has realized that the Ukraine war must be stopped, and if you have to give a sop to the Russians, give it to them, a bit of territory of Ukraine, which is going to do it, a peace treaty, and at the same time break the monolith alliance between Russia and China. Now, this is a very important thing. I think that is the aim of Donald Trump, and we must understand that Donald Trump is going to go about in that manner. So now, gentlemen, the situation is clear. The Chinese are worried. because there are massive tariffs which have been put on them, and they're the ones which are being singled out in the world by Donald Trump. There's likely to be peace in the Ukraine, and tomorrow we do not know because Russian economy is not all that strong, and the sanction on Russia could be lifted, and Donald Trump would like the Russians to be back with the Western world. In that case, he is going to ignore France and England. I mean, he's going to throw them in the waste paper basket because they are, people who have been riding piggyback on the American horse and trying to show that they were big paws. You know the story of the frog who wanted to become a lion? Well, it's like that. And the frog blew himself up, and that's what's going to happen to the French and the British. They're nowhere in this world, and they're going to be sidelined in Ukraine also. So, net result, gentlemen, is that China is sensing what's happening. They wouldn't like to break the alliance with the Russians, but you never know. It could be loosened. I mean, and it could be anything is possible, in this world, because politics means only permanent interests. They're nothing like permanent friends, and that is something which you must remember. So now, what happens to China? China is expecting a lot of problem from the Americans because their economy is now in doldrums. And I understand from information which I'm getting that thousands and thousands of Chinese workers are being laid, sent home, and those that are opposing being put in prison or the concentration camps, and the goods piling at the Chinese seaports because the tariffs are so high that China cannot sell them to America. That is why they're making overtures to India. Suddenly they started remembering India and the Southeast Asian countries, and they're trying to sell everything there. So Modi would be wise to play his cards very carefully now. Another thing is that China has got two restive provinces. The Muslims who are there in Xinjiang are suppressed. The Tibetans who follow Buddhism in Tibet are suppressed. They would like to get out of the Chinese grip, but it's not going to be easy. And now China is doing something else. They have, in a latest decree, banned religion. Now try to understand what this means. Banned religion means you cannot in public wear anything which shows which religion you belong to. And you will not do any festival or any celebration of your religion. That means if you are a priest, a Christian priest, you won't wear that white coat and move around and say that I'm a padri or priest and with a cross around your neck. And if you're a Muslim, you won't keep your beard and cap, you won't have 4 wives, you won't be allowed to do the azan 5 times a day and waste time, you won't be allowed to keep the Ramadan, and you will not be allowed to sermonize in the mosques. Similarly, the restrictions on the Buddhists in Tibet. Now, the purpose of this is very clear. Why the Chinese government is wanting to do away with religion? Because the religion is the breeding ground of separatism. Now, the Muslims, as well known, use the mosque for making all sorts of speeches there, which are anti-government. The Buddhists also are terribly upset with China, and the Christians actually look to America and the West, some of them to the Vatican, and they are trying to convert the Chinese. So once China has banned religion, it's a terrible thing. You can't even hold a congregation or a meeting, and you want to hold it, you have to take the permission of the government. That is the latest decree. And government will send a representative along who will attend that congregation, and if he observes that you are saying anything seditious or talking some nonsense, you will be arrested there and then. So this is the Chinese antidote to the American tariffs and also the collapse of their economy. China has a very big economy, 18 trillion. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to collapse overnight. But then, with jobs not available, as you know, the housing colonies have already bust. The new cities which the Chinese have made are empty. There's nobody to stay there, nobody to buy, and Chinese are not able to sell their goods. They produce about 20 million cars a year, I think, which is about 4 to 5 times what America produces, and all of them are being sold outside. They are not able to sell them now, neither to America, to anybody else. They wanted to pawn off the cars to India, but the Indian government has allowed the Chinese to come to India. So it's a very, very tight situation for China. Economically, there's a big problem, and I do not know how they're going to work it out. So this is the method the Chinese think of, shortcut solutions always. And of course, they have the mailed fist behind. You know, the mailed fist, what it means? You don't obey the Chinese government, you get smashed and you will just die. And maybe your organs will be utilized for some other purpose. This is a very dangerous thing in China. And let's be very frank, in China there are 3,000 to 4,000 executions every year, even now. And only thing it may go up by another 1,000, 2,000. Because in China, you don't tolerate corruption like in India, and you don't tolerate any activity which goes against the state. I think India could take a lesson out of the Chinese book and enforce what the Chinese are doing in the madrasas and in the mosques. You can't have any symbol of Islam displayed. Many of the Chinese Muslims were keeping small beards and wearing caps, and that's all been stopped. You have to shave that beard, or maybe have a beard in a different way. So this is what's happening. And if you were going to hold any, conference or something addressing the people, you'll have to take permission of the Chinese government. And if you don't follow it, you had it, friend. So it's a very, very thing. I think it's about time India acted similarly in the madrasas in India, which are totally controlled by anti-India elements, and they keep on spreading venom against the Indian state and the Hindus, and this is something that is required to be done. There has been a step taken by changing the Waqf Act, but I think that damn act should have been just abolished. Now, there's nothing like the Waqf Act in China. There's nothing like that. All the mosques are state-owned there, and their architecture also has been changed. You've got to have the mosque as per the Chinese architecture. So you can't have those minarets and all that. That's been stopped. And those who have them, they're pulled down. So you may not agree with it. These are very drastic things, but when you're fighting for survival, these things perhaps become essential. Now China's population also is going to get restive. They have not seen democracy, they don't know it. There was in 1890 a movement for democracy, but it ended with the Chinese army shooting 20,000 students, and that was the end of the democratic movement. There was a big massacre at Tiananmen Square in Beijing, and I think that's on record. The Americans couldn't do a damn thing at that time, and Gorbachev, the Russian president at that time, was in Beijing, and he was thinking that he is going to take the Russian state out. He thought, I don't like all this, but he didn't know that the Russian state